Turkan, now I will turn to you. Mr. Jabarli has explained the general framework and then explained how things developed during the recent protests. Can we touch upon the gender aspects of this situation? Because, as I just stated, the last year protests, this wave started as mostly hijab movement, feminist movement. It was triggered by the tragic death of Mahsa Amini, a young woman who was killed by the police for allegedly violating the dress code rules. So in light of these protests, how do you assess the situation the Iranian women mostly find themselves? What are your observations? Thank you.
Yeah, firstly, I'd like to offer you my deepest gratitude for organizing this and being here, and I'd like to thank everyone for just putting the time in and coming and listening to this, I think, really under-discussed and undervalued topic. When we talk about discrimination of any individual, it is, you cannot just think about it from a one-dimensional perspective. Individuals in the world have many different identities, including their gender, their sexuality, their socioeconomic position, like their class, and even the region that they live in. So for being a woman, as is in most places in the world, as is in Iran, only an enhancer of the already existing discrimination. So Iran, it's no surprise that everyone, I'm sure, knows that Iran has very complex anti-women and misogynistic laws and politics. And the gender apartheid, even though it absolutely affects every single woman, regardless of where they are from in Iran, it impacts all of their lives, and it is a right that's stolen from every single woman. And after the protests of Mahsa Amini, the issue of hijab was covered extensively, as it should be, rightfully so. And it's an absolutely significant issue, but it is not the only form of discrimination that needs to be discussed and prioritized. Because when we discuss discrimination, because of these multi-layered identities, and as Kimberly Crenshaw discusses this, we need to look at it from an intersectional feminist perspective. Because the dimensions of an individual's character overlap. And because of this overlap, the exploitation and the discrimination that's felt is often enhanced and it's magnified. So women in Iran, they don't only face discrimination based on their gender, but this discrimination is actually impacts them differently depending on their ethnicity, depending on their religion and where they live and how much education they have, what class do they belong to. So because of this complex matrix of privilege and oppression, we have to analyze the discrimination of women in Iran from this metric. And like mentioned, it is the issue of hijab is absolutely, it's a right that's stolen from every single woman. But there are other issues that are equally important, and if not even more pressing, that's often omitted from the Western media. And these are like issues like honor killings, child brides, access to education, and even environmental issues affect women differently, like access to food and water, as we see the entire globe going through a water shortage. And just to give you guys an example to create an image in your head of this different dimensions of discrimination compared to the hijab issue is, for instance, Farzana Mehdizadeh, who is the Director General of the Clinical Examination Office of the Forensic Medicine Organization, found that in the year 2022, so in only 1 year, 75,000 women in Iran went to hospitals and clinics to seek medical assistance for injuries resulting from domestic violence. And if you guys already know, domestic violence is something that doesn't get reported very much. So these are only the reported statistics, 75,000 women from domestic violence. So while we definitely have to talk about the issue of hijab, but I think we also need to keep in mind that hijab is not the only issue. It's absolutely significant, but the child brides and domestic violence, access to education and food and water, or even like cleaning, like hygienic products like pads and tampons. These are not mentioned or not even talked about in a lot of Western media.
Thank you, Turkan. It was a very good explanation, but if you don't mind, we would go more specific now and try to understand what kind of situation the ethnic minority women, Azerbaijanis, find themselves in. And we can actually broaden this category and speak not only about females, but also children and even teenagers, because I believe their situation is not better than women. So, what have you documented about them, about their situation?
Yeah, so at ائتنیک Yazı, after the protests of the Mahsa Amini, which took months, by the way, if you guys weren't aware, at ائتنیک Yazı, we had an initiative group where we were able to gather enough data and document and release actually quarterly reports based on human rights violations that focused on different aspects of an individual's identity, like children, like their age, or women, like their gender. Just some facts to share with you guys that may be disturbing, but I think it's important that it's said out loud and people understand it, is that 14% of all the deaths that happened throughout the protests were children, were literal children who don't even constitute to be adults. Like if they were in Poland, they can't even drink. Just Sarina Ismailzadeh, who was 16, or Asra Panahi, who was 15, who was taken into custody, tortured, and murdered. And she died as a result of her injuries. Or Neda Bayat, who was just 13. Like, can you guys imagine what you were doing when you're 13? This girl is being beaten to death just because she wants her freedom, just because she wants to be constituted as a human being. And when we talk about the issues of ethnic, this gendered ethnic discrimination, I think we see this omission of Azerbaijani women in Western media, and specifically the Iranian centralized opposition in the West, where when Mahsa Amini was murdered, it was blatantly clear that she was Kurdish. Right? When Faiza Barahui, who was Baluch, right? She was murdered, and everyone knew that she was Baluch. That was her ethnicity. But another famous name that you may have heard of, Hadis Najafi, it was not mentioned in any way that she was Azerbaijani. Or another really famous, Elnaz Rakabi, who is an international climber, and she actually competes internationally. And when these protests were happening, she was in South Korea. And to support her sisters and to support her peers in Iran who were protesting, she took off her hijab, which is banned. You guys already know that. And in nowhere was it mentioned, except the media of the minorities, that she was an Azerbaijani. So we see this omission of the ethnicity of Azerbaijani women. And there's this fabricated myth of passiveness, or like this stigmatized that's applicable to Azerbaijani women, that's not applied to the Persian women in the same way, is that Azerbaijani women are passive bystanders. They're not active participants. Participants. I apologize. And we see this lack of coverage of their form of protest in the Iranian centralist opposition media in exile. Fight for freedom is a constant struggle, and while women and girls in the central metropolitan cities like Tehran choose to beautifully dance on the streets and, you know, take off their hijabs, maybe do their like TikTok, the dances that's really popular, and sing, and those are all wonderful, absolutely beautiful like methods of fighting, and it should definitely happen, and it's mentioned and it gets coverage, but the form of fighting that Azerbaijani women take is omitted, is not mentioned. There's a huge lack of coverage. And just to give you guys an example, just last month actually, Azerbaijani women mobilized and they gathered in the city of Tabriz to fight against an ecological disaster that's threatening the lives of millions of people, not this generation, but the future generations. And not just the Azerbaijani region in Iran, but also the broader, the country of Iran, as well as bordering nations potentially. And of course, I'm talking about the preventable drought of Lake Urmia. They gathered in Tabriz and they were peacefully protesting. This was not mentioned, and the two of the most influential Azerbaijani writers, Rugeya Kabiri and Nigar Khiavi, they were arrested, as the government usually does, and they're probably some of the pioneers or leaders of South Azerbaijani women right now. You know, arresting them is a big deal. It was not mentioned. So by giving these examples, I'm just trying to show the necessity of an intersectional feminist perspective to approach this issue. We need an inclusive approach that's understanding, that's comprehending, and really recognizing the difference, unique challenges that marginalized groups in Iran face, and how they are magnified depending on where they live, where they're from, how much money do they have, you know, did they have the opportunity to go to school. And just lastly, I'd like to say is like another example is that women who don't have Persian as their mother tongue, as their first language, cannot communicate in that language very well, especially if they are from a smaller city or a smaller village where they don't have enough access to education. When these women end up in the legal system in Iran, where the entire system is completely Persian, they don't even have the tool of talking language, the legalese to communicate their problems or to explain. And this isn't just in terms of fighting, but it's in terms of domestic abuse. You know, you want to take your husband to court, you can't because you can't speak the language. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Turkan.